to my colleague in this respect is that what is the answer from this sector European industry to ensure our competitiveness, especially vis-a-vis our Asian colleagues, Asian competitors? This is important question also for us because we are aiming at smart farming, digital agenda, and new precision farming tools. We need those chips. We need those chips in a competitive market, and we preferably would like to see European strong presence. Perhaps it's not realistic to say that we should dominate the market, but we need to have dynamic market where we have some European supplies. How can we ensure this?
Yeah, that is. Thank you for this question. It's a clear question, and I think that's this question is the theme that will go throughout this discussion that we will have. In short, what we are facing at this moment is that because of the worldwide chip shortages, production of goods in Europe is lagging behind. Cars cannot be delivered in time, etc., etc. So it is from that perspective, it's important that Europe is taking on this chip production very seriously, and that will also, I just mentioned automotive industry, but it will also support the agro business. There's a lot of let's say technology and smart things. And smart things always means that there's a lot of electronics and a lot of software involved. Will be needed. So make sure that it can be made in Europe. So we don't have to ask the Asians to change their production schemes in order to support us. The question that I have, Renate, is the following: is that your topic and the topic I have just been discussing on semiconductors have a lot of things in common. We are both talking about independence. We're talking about collaboration, etc. Now, my question to you is: how would you say that this is the starting point of a new approach of the European Commission towards restructuring and refurbishing Europe? I'm very curious to hear your answer on that.
So that's a question
this is an interesting question. To be honest, this is very far-reaching. When you talk about restructuring Europe, I think it's a bit too ambitious. For us, what is happening at the moment, and of course it's not only the European Media Freedom Act, we will discuss it a bit later, it's the Digital Service Act, it's the Digital Market Act, and it's a few years ago the Copyright Directive. It's all regulations that are overdue to deal with our new or with our changing digital ecosystem, which I think we will discuss as well, needs urgent regulation. It has not been able to do at international level yet. In the States, I think they're looking what's happening in Europe. They want to do something like that. It's overdue, it's important. We have been asking for something like that for years, but it's far away from a restructuring.
Okay, so you have important regulatory frameworks to be addressed to preserve, safeguard, maintain media freedom in Europe. It touches upon many different pieces of legislation. But let's just start with the concept itself, media freedom. What are the biggest threats today for media freedom in Europe?
Yeah, and I can just tell you, I've been working for almost 30 years now in that field. And when I started, we had, I think, issues like media pluralism, access to information, working conditions of journalists, media concentration, which were very much high on the level, on the agenda. Today, it's several things. I think The one and first point is a market failure in journalism. We have been experiencing for a few years. There is no sustainable funding anymore for journalism, not only because maybe about 80% of advertisement money is going to the global internet platforms, but also the publishers or the media organization have failed to find sustainable models when they are going digital. There has been too much on for free there, and paywalls now are not the right response. So unless we fix this market failure, we will have problems when it comes to media freedom, because we have increased job losses, we have increased precarity among the working force, among freelance journalists, and that of course has a great impact on quality, but also on media freedom. And not only that, with this fragilization of the media, of the former what we called mass media system, we have an increased politicization. And that comes not only with the so-called Trump effect, but indeed with a slow but surely change within our European member states. We can call it an illiberal turn, or more autocratic governments who I think their first thing they like is to do smear campaigns against journalists, because journalists potentially are critical. They have a watchdog positions, and these politicians, most of the time from the far right, don't like that. So they try to politicize media. First of all, always public service media. It's the easiest thing. And I think the best example we all know is Hungary, but also Poland. In Hungary, Orban just won the elections. Of course he did, because all media is under his control. How can you not win the elections? Putin has shown him the way to go. So that's maybe an extreme, but generally speaking, within the last years, we have had an increase of unprecedented attacks against journalists, both physical but also psychological, a lot of online harassment, specifically towards women journalists or journalists from ethnic minorities. These attacks have been even further increased during the pandemic. We are monitoring them, and in many countries, including in countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, who have been always very strong on press freedom, people attack journalists during anti-COVID measures, demonstrations, or what have you. So that is something that, of course, rings the alarm bell very loud. I'm not sure if pesticides can be sustainable for me. My first connotation with pesticides, it's a negative thing. It's bad for the for food, for agriculture, for the health of the people. So what I would like to know, how you can put the sustainability and the ecological and health element of it together.
Yes, I can understand the question, and I would even say that conventional farming that uses pesticide and synthetic pesticide and synthetic fertilizer is not sustainable. Why? For two reasons mainly. Because it's essentially based on a large use of fossil energy for synthesizing, for instance, nitrogen fertilizer and pesticide, but also because conventional farming decreases soil fertility. And that is not viable on the long term, and so it's not sustainable. So, okay, yes, pesticides that are an essential part of conventional farming are not a sustainable practice. Ukraine crisis has highlighted the fragility of our agri-food sector and revealed the importance of relocating the European economy. Do you see a parallel with the chips production sector?
Super interesting question. I would say parallels, yes and no. Parallels are definitely there regarding the political stance toward global value chains. So basically, with a new focus on open strategic autonomy, what the European Commission and I would say also many member states are doing is they are scrutinizing and questioning their dependence on foreign technology providers or foreign food providers in that matter. So understanding in which areas are we dependent and maybe too dependent on foreign companies and foreign regions. So in that sense, I think there is definitely a parallel between agriculture and semiconductors. I think there are some important differences because with semiconductors and other emerging and foundational technologies such as AI or quantum and others, we talk about highly complex value chains, highly complex products with very deep value chains. And by definition or by history, transnational value chains that are really, really hard to untangle. So I would say that it is substantially easier to decide that you want to produce a certain type of food, of agriculture in your home region again, and deciding that you are too dependent on potatoes, meat, flour, whatever, fertilizer from foreign companies. But it is indefinitely harder to do that for semiconductors, just because of the complexity of the value chain and the market barriers. So my question regarding media freedom would be that, bringing it back to semiconductors, a huge question in semiconductors right now that governments are tackling is, what role do they play in the ecosystem? What is a meaningful role for governments in the global semiconductor ecosystem? So regarding media freedom, I would be interested in the same question. What role do governments play to ensure and protect media freedom, and where do they kind of cross the line to be too protective and actually hurt the media freedom? And how do we tackle that? How do we find the thin red line to do that?
In the first instance, I think, and this is a point I'll make later on, is that the problem definition is essential in all of this. And the problem definition of one of governments having to determine how far they need to regulate the media environment isn't the primary problem in all of this. That the primary problem that we have across Western democracies is the role of propaganda and the extent to which governments and also powerful actors employ propaganda. So whilst, and we will obviously spend some time talking about media freedom and questions of regulation and so on, I'd question the assumptions of the question in a way, that really the problem lies in the areas that I described, as opposed to this question of where does the government, as it were, draw the line with what the media is able to do. Okay, well, we live in a world which is where propaganda is ubiquitous, and so my question would be in the issue of pesticides, whether they should or shouldn't be used and regulated. In your view, where is the propaganda emanating from? Is there propaganda from both sides, i.e. sort of distorted and misleading information being provided? And who's responsible for propagandizing the issue the most, in your opinion, would be my question.
That's a very interesting question. I think propaganda is actually something that we hear a lot now in the news when talking about war. So there is you have two sides and that are using propaganda actually to sort of, promote and saying they are best, they are better, they are winning, the others are losing, and so on. I wouldn't actually talk about propaganda for sort of this conversation. I would rather talk about exchange of information, or trying to demonstrate that we have the solutions. We have a common objective, that is the transformation of the sector, of the way we produce food, and it's about so the objective is common, and it's about basically sort of discussing the solutions, discussing the options that we have to get there. So the what is clear for everyone. It's the how we're going to get there. So, and of course, we're going to have, among all stakeholders, people that will promote their solutions and all that will promote their solutions, and that's how it works. And then it's going to be up to the regulator, to the policymakers, to take a decision on actually sort of, on not what is the best solution, but what are the solutions that will help us getting to the common objective. And in that respect, CropLife Europe, by having sort of the toolbox of crop protection solutions, is part of that conversation that needs to happen. So I wouldn't go into propaganda. I would rather go into exchange of views, and in a respectful way, and also explaining sort of why our solutions are part of the solution. So I would actually have two questions. The first one is why chips are important. Very basic question. I'm not familiar at all with the sector. The other one is about the semiconductor shortage. So what are the lessons learned from Europe's reaction to the global semiconductor shortage? It's been all over in the news, so that would be actually interesting to hear some thoughts about it.
Well, chips are important. Yes, of course, they probably without people knowing so much. For people, probably chips were essentially French fries, and without their knowing, they are actually everywhere. Inside, of course, you know probably inside your phone, in the past, you could open it to change the battery, and so you would see that there were also components. You probably would not know that exactly what there was inside, and probably if you look everywhere around you, so of course your computer that your TV, your car, even an old car already had calculator and things like that, and so it's really a very important component of all our equipment that we have around us. So they are getting more and more complex. We see that everywhere. When you compare what your phone was doing even 10 years ago, and you cannot even find your way without it, unfortunately, nowadays. So there is much, much more inside that than what there was before. And so they are everywhere. And actually, coming to the second question, of course, we take them for granted, of course, and it's of course when they are missing that we realize how dependent we are on them, like on many things. When you are deprived from things, then you realize how important they were, and they could not be taken for granted. You could probably, maybe you or me, because that we could probably survive a little bit with our mobile phone. I'm not sure the young generation could spend so long without it, but there are even also of course in the security that we have everywhere around, to even in the finance market, the transaction, your money in the bank now is stored with chips. It's really relying. Lots of things are really based on their properly functioning. So no, it's extremely important, and of course the security, sovereignty can be impacted. We have seen, of course, the importance of technology in the recent war in Ukraine, and so the fact that Ukraine could resist against against Russia was also thanks to a lot of technology coming from the West, and of course the technology is also heavily relies on the chips that we have inside. Again, almost everything, again, including then weaponry. Freedom of the media is at some point related to money. And so independence is related to money, and so there was a lot of issues on the social media which were diffusing for free editorial content, and how can the EU be successful in making them contributing to that. And the other one, which is going even further, that we see more and more media which are now under the control of billionaires. And so how can you make editorial, again, freedom, sort of freedom of media without this money question, without also going into the other part, which is now being run by governments. And probably I don't know if there is a narrow path in between.
Very interesting questions. They raise some interesting points. I'll try maybe to comment briefly. At least the way I interpret the question, one key point is the economic sustainability of the press sector, and the economic sustainability is clearly of key importance, and I would separate the economic sustainability from the regulatory intervention in the way the sector is organized, because traditionally, historically, we will touch on this, the press sector has always relied on self-regulation and not on regulatory intervention. So basically, what is important from my point of view, connecting it to the first part of the question that was raised, is making sure, at least at the European level, that the sector, the press industry operates under the right economic and framework conditions. And what I have in mind here is the creation of the press publishers' right in the copyright directive, which was designed as a tool to enable the press sector to get compensation for the use of their content by the big platforms. And I think audiences are familiar with the way those big platforms, and I have in mind specifically two, a big search engine and a big social network, have been exploiting the content, press content, so content of press publishers, to develop, expand, and build their business model. So the copyright directive and the press publishers' right was a first regulatory intervention, if you want, but that it was needed in the sense that it had to rebalance the market imbalance, because I think the professor also had in mind that the press has been experiencing a decline in its print in the last years, and of course a decline in advertising revenues. And those advertising revenues are not going to come back easily these days, because we have been gone through the COVID crisis that has also made things more difficult. And now, after the war in Ukraine, we have an energy crisis and we have a paper crisis. And as the press has been also trying to, to move to a digital model, all the crises have been piling up on each other to make the whole landscape even more challenging. So just to sum up, what we need and what the press basically needs has been the right economic conditions, the right framework conditions to make it sustainable for the future. One first path was the press publishers' right. Then came the Digital Markets Act to rebalance this imbalance in the digital markets. So to oblige the social network and the search engine that we know very well to provide fair and non-discriminatory access conditions to their services, which is also needed because they are major, important distribution channels these days. And of course, the younger people get their news basically from this kind of services these days. And a comment on ownership. Yes, I mean, there are issues with ownership in some member states, but we have somehow to separate or to distinguish, if you want, the issues and make clear that in the COVID world, mergers and acquisitions, if I may put it like this, consolidation has made it possible for local and small press already under pressure for many years to survive. And there are examples like these coming from different countries across Europe. And I have in mind smaller countries like Portugal, like Denmark in the north, but also bigger countries. So what the European Commission, and maybe we are already entering the debate on the Media Freedom Act, has been doing with this regulatory intervention around the questions of ownership, acquisitions, mergers, might have in mind good intentions to address these kind of problems that are there in specific countries. However, spreading them across Europe, I'm not convinced is going to solve this kind of problems. On the contrary, it will risk undermining the media situation in other countries that are not experiencing the political problems that are behind the question of the professor, at least the way I interpret it. So that would be my response.